Okay, so I'm Sandy, and I'm a systems engineer at DreamHost. I've been teaching Python for about 2 years now. I've done tutoring one-on-one. I've done workshops for high schoolers and adults.
Hi, I'm Christine. I'm a freelance web developer. I've full stack, front end, back end, a little bit of systems, and I've had a few years experience teaching Python to local user groups and to, other groups as well.
So why teaching? The answer to this question is different for all of us. I think for Christine and I, we have a passion for sharing what we know. We love to contribute to the community and give back. And also we're really interested in diversity efforts. Getting more women, more minorities into the Python community is really important to us. And teaching is learning twice. When you teach other people a concept that you already know, you will learn something about that you didn't know before, because they're going to challenge you and you're going to be like, well, you're right. I don't know how to do that or what that means.
So if you decide to start teaching, you sort of everyone teaches for a different reason, and we all we might have different, expectations or reasons for why we want to teach, and it's important to have goals set. So, for the best for your students, and also for yourself, to keep up momentum, you should always think, why am I teaching? What do I want to get out of it? Especially if you're thinking well, who do I want to teach? Is it just anybody, or do I want to, be involved in outreach, teaching women or minorities or children?
So maybe you're here because you're thinking about starting to teach Python, and it's kind of a daunting thing, right? If you've never taught before. When I started teaching Python, I had never taught anyone before. And there's a lot of different entry points you can go for. The easiest one is starting with a volunteer group. I've done some volunteer group with an organization called Iridescent Learning in Los Angeles, and it's great because when you start out with an existing group, they already have a venue, they have staff, they have a student network, and so pretty much you say, here's my skill set, I want to come teach your students, and they're always happy to have you there. You can also form your own volunteer group, which is a lot more work. You've got to find other people to help you, you have to find a venue, you have to find sponsors, you have to get the word out to students. So I recommend starting out with volunteering. So tutoring is another option. Sorry guys, tutoring is another option. I've done some private tutoring with family, friends, and students that I know through colleagues, and that's gone pretty well. I've taught in corporate and non-corporate environments. Also, there's for-profit training, which is another option that you might want to consider.
So you've decided to teach, now you need material to work off of. And you have two options basically to make your lesson plans. Either, I would recommend obviously for beginners to take existing materials. Popular one is Learn Python the Hard Way, or other books geared toward teaching Python, or just Python materials. It's good to start off with adapting from other people's materials with permission. And from there, once you start teaching, perhaps you want to write your own based on your experiences teaching.
It's really important to know your material, regardless of where you get your material. If you're in front of a class of students and you aren't familiar with it, they're not going to be comfortable, you're not going to be comfortable, and they're not going to get as much out of the experience. You have to be prepared, so that includes reviewing your slides. Go through all of your slides, go through all of your code examples, and build a complete functional code demo, all the code that you want to get through in the course. This way, if the student says, hey, I can't get this to work, you can pull up your example and look at it and say, okay, well, here's how I did it here, and here's how you can fix it. So it just makes the whole experience more professional and valuable for everyone. Also, you're going to get asked questions by your students that, even really beginner students, they'll ask questions that you're not really sure how to answer. And at that point, what I've always done is say, okay, cool, I don't know how to do this either, let's work together and figure it out. And that generally gets a very positive response from the students because it gives you a really great opportunity to engage with them.
When you start teaching, most likely you may run out of time. You'll have more material than time left to teach it. So it's good to think about this, and when you go through material, kind of look at, okay, how much time do I have? Do I have an hour left? Do I have half an hour left? Or am I in the middle? And you can assess from there whether you want to speed through parts or have flexible ending points so you can stop at a certain chapter.
Knowing your audience, also really important, right? Because when you're teaching a group of people, if you're not on their level, then they're not really getting anything out of the workshop. Usually, I've taught beginners and intermediates. probably taught a few experts and maybe didn't realize it. Most workshops are a mix of skill levels. They tend to slant towards beginner and intermediate, but sort of understanding what your group is comprised of is going to help you tailor your material. And even for future workshops, you'll sort of say, okay, this class kind of attracts this level of experience, and my slides are a little bit too low or too high level for them, and then you can tailor that material for the next workshop, and essentially you get better with iteration.
You should always assess their skill levels early. Even if you say it's a beginner course or intermediate course or this is a course on Django, you should probably send a survey asking their experience with programming, whether they've done Python before, or they've done other programming, or maybe they're just there as for a refresher course. So it's good to kind of gauge what their levels are at. If you got complete beginners, you got experienced people, or a mix of both, and then through that you can kind of gauge the pace of the course. You can omit certain parts or speed through certain parts. And even while teaching, you can figure out, like, okay, even though this is a beginner class, they're all picking up the material pretty quickly, so I may, I don't have to spend as much time on a certain section.
Classroom demographics, that's another thing to consider when once you get to the workshop. Obviously, this isn't necessarily something you're going to know until the day of, but once you're in the classroom, you can say, okay, I've got people from age 15 to 65, I've got about 50-50 men and women, I've got people who are artists, homemakers, engineers, scientists, all across the spectrum. And depending on how your classroom group is segmented, is going to also affect the way that you deliver your material. Because a lot of people, the different age groups learn differently, different genders learn differently, and people with different career backgrounds are going to grasp concepts differently.
So once you start your class, say if it's a 5-hour class, you should probably plan like an hour of that of setup, because you never know what operating system or what dependencies they have installed or not, and you should probably list requirements early. Say I only want certain operating systems, make sure it's a certain version of Python, and always offer early setup time. So maybe like half an hour to an hour, you can come to the class early to help them set up their environment, and also list, like, make sure you have specific this database or this version of Python, or make sure we only support Mac and Linux, and Windows are kind of on your own.
Yeah, I mean, even if you list the requirements earlier and you encourage your students to come early for setup, you'll still get plenty of students who show up unprepared. And a lot of times they just didn't know how to do what you were asking them to do, or they ran out of time. All these things happen. So being prepared at the day of the workshop to handle these issues is going to help things go a lot more smoothly. Windows is the biggest issue. Most of the students I've worked with tend to come with either Mac or Unix. Usually there's a lot of Macs. A workshop I taught recently was all Windows laptops. So it really depends on the audience, but with Windows, it's not difficult to set up. It's just you kind of have to know how to do it. You have to go in and set an environment variable, and it's not necessarily intuitive. So you should have this documentation available to other helpers at your workshop, like your mentors, your other organizers, and also the students. Sometimes you wind up also where people will bring in old OSs. I think we've had like PowerBooks and
like Panther,
and with Panther running on it, and those are never. That's never a good time for anyone, because they don't have the latest. They have like Python 2.4 running or something, and the workshop requires 2.7. That's not going to work. So having loaner laptops is a great idea, rather than spending 3 hours breaking/upgrading a bunch of dependencies on the old iBook or whatever it's called.
And especially important, since you're teaching Python, to make sure they have the correct version, whether you want to teach 2.7 or 3. And it's very important that you don't mix and match. This is only Python 3 class, or this is a 2.7 class. And one of the interesting problems is that a student may not realize they have Python installed on their computer and will try to install it on their own. So sometimes I may encounter students that have like 3 different versions of Python, and you kind of have to like figure out like how to use the correct one, or maybe even make a symlink to the correct version of it. And for more intermediate and advanced students, it's always a good idea to consider a virtual environment.
So engaging with students is going to make a big difference between whether or not they come back to your next workshop, whether or not they take what they learn and go do something else with it later. It's really easy. So you get 3 groups of students in any workshop. There's a group that's falling behind, there's a group that's right on track with the lesson plans, and then there's a group that's zipping ahead because maybe they took a visual basic class or something, or maybe they took a C class and they already kind of know the basics. So in cases like that, each of these different groups of people have different ways that they need to be engaged and different frequencies and regularities with which they need to be engaged during the course of the workshop.
So there are actually, when you start teaching beginners, there are actually different types of beginners. Typically, younger beginners have been exposed to computers for most of their life, and they're more adventurous and they're willing to break things and seeing how things work because they know the computer won't explode on them. Versus older people that are kind of like more conservative, that might be their first introduction to anything remotely kind of like doing anything programming or modifying anything on their computer. So when you start teaching them, they only want to stay within the bounds of their exercise, very careful to not do something different because they're kind of afraid of what might happen to their computer.
So absolute beginners are a particularly interesting group to work with. They don't really know, you can't assume that they know anything, right? You have to say, I mean, we all kind of know it's a string and an integer and a for loop, and they don't really understand any of those concepts or what a variable is. They don't even understand those concepts. So don't make any assumptions when you're working with these guys. Also, everyone learns a little bit differently. I found that a lot of times what's helpful is to explain a concept 3 or 4 different ways and kind of go through it multiple times, because it's good for even the people who get the concept to hear it again. Because with computer science, I think, as we all pretty much know, it's repetition and practice until it's second nature to you. So letting them hear this again and again in different ways is going to get a lot of good coverage within the group of who understands the concept and who doesn't. Taking it slow, encouraging lots of questions. You know, if there are no questions, what you can do is you can say, all right, guys, so who can tell me why X worked? Right? And eventually, somebody's going to raise their hand or speak up and say, oh, I think it's this, and then it makes the conversation start.
When you're teaching a class, probably there will be some students that are kind of behind, and it's kind of important to figure out who these people are because they probably need help the most. And it's actually kind of difficult sometimes because they're not very obvious to spot. If they kind of give up, they kind of fall back in the class. They don't want to, they're shy and embarrassed. They don't want to admit that they're like 5 exercises behind, and they'll be like, well, you know, I'll just sit here, pretend, you know, I know what I'm doing, and then they're just, you know, kind of sitting there.
Yeah, it's a combination between being embarrassed that they don't know something and afraid of holding the rest of the class back, afraid of getting called out, singled out, and embarrassed in front of the whole class.
Especially in a room with like mixed levels of experience. You know, sometimes there are people that, you know, pick up the material very quickly and speed through it, and so you might go through the exercises much more quickly. And sometimes the beginners, the people who are not as experienced might, you know, they feel kind of intimidated. Well, oh, I should have known this already. This is when, if you have like helpers or mentors, that's really important to kind of scan the room and see if everyone's on kind of the same exercise, and then you can utilize one-on-one help to make them, you know, so that they're not struggling.
So with your advanced students, or your more seasoned, experienced students, you're going to see that they get bored, right? When they get bored, they're still engaged at this point. They're still interested in the material, but they're probably not looking up at you anymore. They're not really listening to you. They're kind of working at their own pace, head down, on, you know, typing on the keyboard. And they'll kind of pull aside a mentor and say, hey, you know, come help me with this exercise. And that's perfectly fine, as long as they're not disrupting the class, and as long as there's still mentors to go around for everyone else who's working on task. That's fine behavior. But at some point, you do need to still keep these guys engaged. If they're going to finish up the workshop and be sitting there for the remaining 2 or 3 hours, like, what are you doing? So bonus exercises at the end of each module that are a little more challenging and a little more in-depth is a great way to kind of put a little roadblock on these guys and get them to think about the exercise a little more and slow down.
Sometimes, like, instead of just jamming through all the exercises and just saying, like, you know, this is how to do this, and this is what this is. It's good to take short social breaks so your students can actually start talking to each other. If you have group work, then, you know, they might, you know, are more interested in the class than just, okay, I'm listening to an instructor, versus if they're talking, meeting their neighbors, maybe they have a friend, and then they can work on these things together. It's also good to, keep it a little light, not just, oh, this is all technical. And you can also take the time to demo interesting projects in Python, maybe Raspberry Pi, or like a robot that plays Angry Birds, or maybe even like a web scraper that like shows you all the latest happy hours, or kind of like incentives for them to learn Python, perhaps.
Yeah, let them know all the cool, fun stuff they can do.
Yeah.
So beginners have a lot of questions, obviously, and we compiled a few that were kind of recurring. A lot of people, believe it or not, I guess it's completely believable. Like if they aren't technical at all, they'll be like, well, okay, open a shell, open Python. They'll open a shell and they'll start typing, Python commands into Bash or whatever, and obviously that's not going to work. So you have to tell them, okay, start your interpreter, right? So that's one thing that people can get sidetracked really early on if it's not clear. String formatting is another thing. They'll be like, well, what's %D? What's %S? What's a raw string? What's a Unicode string? When do I use which? So these are things that as a person who uses programming or uses Python for scripting, on a semi-regular basis, I don't really think about these things a lot. I just do them. And it helps to kind of review those simpler libraries and get an idea of saying, okay, I need to really be able to answer this question definitively. Data structures, lists versus tuples. People, what's a list for? Tuples and lists look the same to me, so be prepared to explain mutable versus immutable and the benefits of hashable data types at a relatively, straightforward level, something that a beginner could understand. Math is another one they tend to come up with. So I always tell my students, I'm like, just think of it like you're doing math problems. It's basically the same type of thing. So if you know the order of operations, Python's going to follow the order of operations. So I tell them, pretend you're in math class. That's what I've told my high school students. Another thing that I found they really enjoy is when you show them PDB, they get really excited, because if they've learned enough Python to get to the point where they're doing simple functions, that's when PDB becomes really useful, because they actually can use it to see exactly what's happening in their code. Also, class design. People will be like, well, what is a class for? What do I need a class when I could just use a function for this? So I tend to take real-world examples like a car, right? A car which has member variables like color and number of wheels and four-wheel drive or two-wheel drive. It has member functions, maybe like color change or put the window down or put the window up, things like that. And then it gives them a really good example of a real-world case where you could design a class around an object that has a lot of properties and things you can manipulate.
Sometimes you might encounter a situation where there's no questions. The students are kind of silent and just following along. They may be shy. They may not know what to say. So sometimes you might put in relatable stories. For example, your experiences being a developer, or kind of any interesting things you've used Python to solve. And sometimes you have to kind of probe them, like ask them questions, especially if you're going through an exercise and you'll be like, well, can you explain how did this work the way it worked? And if you keep asking them and kind of trying to encourage questions, they'll probably start being more receptive to it.
So dealing with difficult students, I've been pretty fortunate. I haven't had any really difficult students in my class, but it's good to engage them, answer their questions honestly, but at the same time, don't feed the trolls, right? You don't want to wind up with one student just running the whole class because he or she keeps asking questions that are derailing us from the topic. Say, hey, let's talk at lunch, or let's talk after the workshop, and I can answer all your questions then. But in the meantime, let's keep on topic, right? Class disruption, another thing. Usually not a big deal, but if it does happen, deal with it during the break. I think that's, because the thing to remember at workshops like this, everyone's there because they want to be there. People are generally well-mannered and well-behaved and happy, so.
Yeah, and sometimes you'll have some troll just trying to come up with something super advanced. They'll be like, if you're teaching 2.27, they'll be like, well, what do you think about this meta program in Python 3, or how do you deploy in Heroku or whatever? And then all these other students are like, I don't know what that is, and all of a sudden they feel kind of intimidated. It's good to kind of address really quickly what that is, but they may not necessarily have to know that. So you want to teach Python, but you also need a place to teach it. So when you're trying to decide a venue, there are several ways to go about it. The easiest way is if you're going through a local user group, they might already have connections with companies or a space they own to teach. Or if you're trying to find a place, you can always be creative and think about businesses, hackerspaces, schools, or especially if you're teaching a for-profit workshop, you might, rather rent a venue.
knowing your venue is really important. Obviously, if you're going to teach a coding class, you need some things like internet, power, tables and chairs, and a projector. You don't want to wind up in a situation where you're daisy chaining like five power strips so that everybody has power. That's not safe or really doable, really easy, except if you do it at home sometimes, that's okay, but not with your students. Tables and chairs, I prefer a traditional chair and desk environment for a classroom. Some venues have like kind of a lounge setup where there's couches and stuff. It really depends on your preference. I think people learn better in a more classroom structured environment. Having a projector, really important. I've tried to teach a class when the projector went down. I tried to teach with just referencing slide numbers, and it's not really easy to do. It's kind of hard. It adds extra overhead to the teaching process because you have to stop and explain. It's good to have backup plans. Things like if you can have like a portable projector, bring that. Bring a few extra power supplies. Bring collapsible tables and chairs if you think you might need them, and thumb drives in case the internet goes down. Thumb drives with the lesson plans loaded on them.
It's also good to know the neighborhood of where you're teaching, especially if not everyone has a car. If you're able to take public transportation through like a train or a bus, and especially nearby food options or market options. Even if you're supplying food for your class, if you can't meet all their dietary needs, maybe someone's vegan and all you have is like pepperoni pizza, so they might have to go out and search for their own food. Also, of a bar for a social event later. Also, one thing that it's really good to think about is to know if there's any conflicting events or something that's happening nearby at the same time. One time we were teaching at USC, and usually it's easy to find parking. It's easy a destination to get to. But one time we were teaching a workshop, and there was like a walkathon going on, so they blocked off the entire area, and most students did not know how to get there throughout all the traffic, and it was like tough to find, and it was just like everyone was really frustrated. And it's good to figure out if something is going to happen to either reschedule or let the students know in advance.
So retaining students is a challenge, right? Because they have a great time at the workshop, they learn a lot of cool stuff, and then they go home, right? Or they go back to their day jobs and their families, and they don't think about Python again for a while, maybe. So that enthusiasm is only going to last for so long. It has a very short shelf life. So it's great to have another workshop planned that you can announce at the end of your first workshop and say, hey guys, we had a lot of fun. Come to my intermediate workshop next week. Here's how you sign up. That way it keeps the momentum going. Giving them extra assignments. Say, hey, we learned this concept. Go home and code something. Bring it to the next workshop. We'll play with it. It keeps them engaged. Let them know like where the local Python meetup group is, where the Django meetup group is, where the tech happy hour things are happening so that they know how to get involved in the community. Once you have those social connections, people are much more inclined to stay involved and continue programming in Python. I use meetup.com a lot. Twitter is also great for this. Eventbrite, Facebook sometimes is also useful.
It's also good to have a post survey. So you might have a survey already written up for, maybe even 2/3 way of the class or at the end of the class saying, how did you like this? What did you learn? Like, what did you want to learn? And then through this feedback, it's really good information for things you can figure out to tailor better for your next class.
So for wrap up, I think we have a few minutes left, so I just wanted to say, I guess, what I was speaking on earlier, just about getting involved with an existing volunteer organization. I work with Iridescent Learning, which is based in LA, but they do have an office up in the Bay Area as well, and one in New York. They get kids from underserved communities and bring them in and teach them STEM concepts. So it's really cool. I had a lot of fun working with those kids, and I'm hoping to go back next month and start doing an intermediate Python workshop. They had a great time, and I noticed some of the most amazing things, like working with them, where they'd be like, I was teaching the Turtle Library, which is a simple graphics, drawing library, and I was like, okay, move the pointer this way, move the pointer that way, go 90 degrees, let's draw a box. And I walked around the classroom, and there were some kids who were drawing like elaborate geometric structures, and some of them had set their pointer rotation to some huge number, and it was just infinitely spinning. And so they were having a lot of fun with it. And I enjoy teaching adults too, but I think teaching kids is something everyone should do once, just to see, how it is different. They are much more adventurous.
Yeah, it's just fun, to just share your knowledge. And when you start teaching people that may have limited technical knowledge, to see their faces kind of like light up, when they've figured something out.
Okay, questions?
Well, if you have any questions, please walk up to the microphone.
Okay. So you were talking about beginner people or people that are like slightly behind and having them to need mentors and such, and then you're talking about people that are more advanced. Do you ever use the more advanced people as sort of impromptu mentors, like, hey, come help your neighbor over here with this sort of thing? Have you found that to be very successful, or are there any pitfalls with that?
I found it to be very successful. In fact, generally, the students who are a little more advanced, a little more on top of things, are really eager and excited to help the kids who are falling behind. Adults and kids, I shouldn't say just kids. But they're really eager to help their fellow students. And I haven't seen any issues with that. I guess the only thing that might come up would be if a student who is falling behind becomes too dependent on a student mentor and then isn't really getting the concepts, they're just kind of coasting.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Do you have any recommendations for like a point of contact with school districts or anything on finding out if there are opportunities for teaching kids? I wouldn't know who to start emailing.
Yeah, I have a contact at Iridescent. I don't know where you're based at, but come find me and I will give you her information. And basically what they do is they get kids from LAUSD and they're sort of the middleman, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the easiest way because I wanted to teach kids for a while, and I was like, well, how do I go to the LAUSD and say, I want to teach kids? You know, it's a little more complicated. So I can try to find out what would be in your area.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, just meet me by the stage. Yeah.
As a side note, if you're interested in pursuing paid Python instruction, my company's hiring, so come talk to me. But a couple of questions. One, like on the software end of things, I'm curious if you have any software that's been useful in instruction. I'm curious if you've used IDLE at all and what you think about that, and if you've used like IPython Notebook. You mentioned Turtle. Any recommendations along those lines?
I think IDLE is great for Windows environments because you don't have to deal with a lot of the drama that you deal with when you're just installing Python and using a terminal or interpreter. And I think you know about
well, IPython Notebook is kind of new, I think, and there's been a lot of talk about it at PyCon this year. We ourselves haven't tried it out, but it seems like a really good learning tool, especially sharing code snippets and putting in math equations and stuff. It's definitely a good, useful tool to check out. But what we've traditionally done was just go through. Just learn Python the hard way, and them having open up just code and just code away.
Cool. And then one more question, I guess, and I don't know, I keep on coming in with negative questions for people, but what I actually think what your experiences have been is an important one to share with the Python community, because you reach out to people who are not the typical people attending PyCon, right? People who are here are mostly like expert users and power users, and they know how things work and how Python's worked for a decade. But you teach people who are new to Python and maybe new to programming. What sucked the most about that? What could Python do to make it easier to bring beginners into programming?
I think you just need more classes,
yeah.
Especially when teaching women. They're very in our experience, a lot of them are either from all different backgrounds. They're librarians or homemakers or artists or something totally random and non-technical. And once you start engaging them and giving them power, oh, programming is not as hard as I thought it was, and they become more empowered and they feel much more jazz about actually it's not some weird thing, mystical black box thing. They thought, I'm not a hacker,
Yeah, I think we just need more people actually going out and doing these workshops, and less I know we've just been talking about it, but less talking about it, more actually going in and follow through and doing it and coming back to PyCon the next year and saying, here's what I did, here's how many people I reached out to, and hey, maybe one of them even liked it so much they decided to come to PyCon, because the type of retention that you have, if you teach a class of 20, 30 students, maybe one of them will actually really get into Python, right? So the conversion rate's not that high, but you give people introduction to things and it sparks an interest and they take off and do some amazing things.
Okay, so that's all the time we have. Thank you very much.